Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. In the spirit of the trees, in the spirit of all of living nature, in gratitude for our ancestors who brought us to the present time and place, I want to greet you for this session of Humanity Rising. I want to begin our program today by just recalling one of the meta themes of our proceedings from the very beginning, back in the spring of 2020, when the world was entering into the depths of the pandemic, and we've been broadcasting ever since as we've sought with partners from around the world to create a global commons where people everywhere from all walks of life can gather together in community as the world traverses, I would say almost careens from one crisis to another, the latest of which is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Over the last couple of years, almost every indicator of social dis-ease and stress has been escalating, not just in the United States or in Western Europe, but in South America, Africa, Asia. We've been looking at climate change. We've been looking at the fact that democracy is under assault and people are all inflamed. Stresses are everywhere. Suicides are up. Domestic violence and abuse, drug abuse, neuroses, depressions, crime, road rage is all around us. As the world now is in a frame of escalating turbulence all around. Just here in the United States over Easter weekend, Passover on Friday to Easter on Sunday, this past week, there were 4 major shootings just in the United States. That's a measure of the inflammation of the human soul. So one of the meta themes of Humanity Rising is how do we, in the midst of this tumult, how do we create calm? How do we generate coherence? How do we regenerate our interiors so that our interior coherence is able to both navigate through the chaos, but maintain its equilibrium in the midst of escalating chaos? That's basically, I would say, the number one challenge in our world at this moment. And so periodically we go into different parts of the world and into different spiritualities. Yesterday, we delved into a Buddhist practice with a practitioner from Hungary that from the age 16 just knew that he was to be a Buddhist monk and practitioner and has dedicated his life to Buddhist practice. And today, we're going to go to South India, to the vast subcontinent that has embraced the Hindu religion and spirituality in all of its multifaceted forms. And we're going to look at a book that probably most of you have never heard of, called the Kural, and talk with the gentleman who spent 20 years immersing himself in it and finally came out with a brilliant translation that is now making it available in the English-speaking world. But before we dive into that masterpiece from South India, let us just take a moment, as we always do, to just center ourselves in our bodies. Take a breath, close your eyes, and attune yourself with your heartbeat. And as you attune yourself to your heart, feel solidarity everywhere with people just like you, just like me, just like us, who more than anything want peace in our world. Thank you, everyone. It's my pleasure and privilege now to introduce you to Thomas Hitoshi Pruiksma, an American who found his way to South India many years ago and began a journey into a South Indian masterpiece of mysticism that speaks about love and ethics and power, and was so drawn to it, and out of which he learned Tamil and started to write poetry, and finally just translated this masterwork. And through Andrew Harvey, who's been on our program before, a great contemporary mystic and author in his own right, he introduced me to Thomas. We had a conversation, and I was so fascinated by what he was doing and what he'd accomplished in translating this very little known outside India, but very profoundly known inside India. So today, Thomas is going to make that available to us. And I read his book, and it is a brilliant translation. So Thomas, I want to welcome you to Humanity Rising. I've asked Thomas, first of all, just to tell us his story of how he grew up and how he ended up in South India translating this extraordinary masterpiece. So Thomas, welcome to Humanity Rising.
Thank you, Jim. It's really a great and humbling honor and pleasure to be here with you and with everyone, all of us who are here gathered together from the different places that we are gathered in the one place that we also gather in solidarity in our community of communities and in our heart and our shared heart. I am so glad to tell the story of this work because the Kural, the Kural, to use the full name, is an extraordinary masterpiece, which is on par with works like the Tao Te Ching, the poetry of Rumi, the Bhagavad Gita, and yet it's a work for a number of different reasons that we can discuss a little later that hasn't really entered into the English-speaking world, isn't really known in the English-speaking world yet. But to describe it in that way can make it seem like some big thing. And of course, it is a big and revered work. But I came to it through the back door. And I came to it in a series of unusual and fortuitous circumstances and coincidences that I'd love to tell you about. I was born in Seattle born and raised in Seattle, Washington, in the United States. And I was already as a child standing between two worlds. There was the world of my mother's family, which comes originally from Okinawa. And my grandparents lived on Maui among the Okinawan American community on Maui, and my mother was born there. And then my father's roots go back to the Netherlands and to Friesland. And so even as a child, I was standing between worlds, coming to understand what it means to, grow up and go to church on Sundays. But then when I went with my family to Maui in the summer, when we were able to do so, we light incense for the ancestors, and we would dance in the cemeteries, honoring the dead. And so I had these worlds already combining in me. When I graduated from college, I had had a plan. And my plan had been to go to southern Mexico, learn Spanish, live in an indigenous village, and learn something about the relationship between people and land and community. And I was in the running for a fellowship, and I was quite convinced that this was my destiny and future. And I received a letter on address dated no less on my birthday that said, "Thank you very much for your application. We enjoyed reading it, and unfortunately, we're not giving you this particular fellowship." And they gave the usual reasons, and I thought my life was over. I thought everything had come to a dead end, because I had become so committed to what I imagined was my future that I couldn't see any other possibility. And then something slipped in through the back door. There was a fellowship that my college offered, a 2-year fellowship, to go and teach in South India, to study the Tamil language, to teach English, and then we would be given freedom to explore whatever else might be interesting to us. And a professor who called me into her office and said, "Hey, maybe you should check out this fellowship," pointed out as well that I could go and I could do in South India what I had hoped to do in southern Mexico, which was to explore rooted village community life. And even though I had been fascinated by India since I was a child, and even though I had gone on an abroad program my junior year that spent 10 weeks in India, specifically to have those 10 weeks in India, it felt like a big leap for me. I had thought, Spanish would be practical in North America because there are so many Spanish speakers there. But the South Indian language, Tamil, as interesting as it might be in the abstract, I wasn't sure how that would be useful to me or what it would lead to. And yet, as I sat with it, I found myself surprised to discover my answer was yes, that I would take this opportunity and go to South India. And I went to live in the city of Madurai in the state of Tamil Nadu, which is the cultural capital and has been the cultural capital of this language for millennia. And as a little background about the Tamil language, this is a language which is the other classical language of India, along with Sanskrit. And it has the distinction of being a living classical language with more than 2,000 years of continuous literary history. And a whole family of languages grow out of Tamil. All of the South Indian languages are part of the Dravidian family of languages. So Malayalam in the state of Kerala, Kannadam, Telugu in the states to the north of Tamil Nadu are all connected to Tamil. And when I arrived in Madurai, I had really one aim. I wanted to learn how to speak Tamil well enough to be able to live in a village. And I found an extraordinary teacher, Dr. K.V. Ramakodi, who guided me into the spoken language, which I thought would be more than enough. I had at the time almost renounced reading and writing, not forever, but really wanting to enter the oral world of this village. And then, about a year into my 2-year stint, my teacher said, "You know what, Tom, it's now time for us to learn to read and write." And I said, "Well, sir, of course, that sounds like a wonderful thing, but I think my hands are already quite full enough with learning to speak this language, which, as you know, has given me quite a bit of difficulty to even begin learning." And he said, "Well, when you return to your country, you are going to write us letters, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes, sir, of course, I will write." And he said, you will want to be able to read the replies that we'll send you. And I said, yes, of course. And he said, then we'll begin tomorrow. And he began taking me through the government readers for the Tamil language, starting from basically the equivalent of kindergarten all the way through to the equivalent of 12th grade. And in this journey, he also introduced me to poetry. And I say introduced because although I had studied poetry in school, like many people do, I had found poetry to be opaque. Poetry was presented to me as a kind of puzzle, and I never really got excited about it. I thought I should be excited about it. I knew people talked about poetry as something important, but it was sort of locked to me. It was sealed away behind some door, and no one had given me the key. So back to being in my Tamil teacher's house, and he introduced me to poetry through a 12th century Tamil woman poet and saint named Avvayar, a wisdom teaching poet. And I memorized some 25 of her 4-line poems. And because these poems are from the 12th century, and even though they're extraordinarily accessible, they weren't yet accessible to me. I was still learning her vocabulary, her way of speaking. Something very interesting happened as I was memorizing these poems, because I couldn't yet understand them directly. That was coming later. All I could do at the beginning, as I was memorizing them, was listen to them. To listen to the sounds of her words, of her language, of the rhythm of these phrases that she strings together. And I noticed something. I noticed that these poems sound good. They have music to them. There is a delight in speaking them out loud with my whole body, breath and tongue and throat and lungs, ears listening to the words issuing from my mouth. And this proved to be the key I'd been looking for without knowing I'd been looking for it, which was to experience poetry out loud, in the body, embodied in the body, and to enjoy the music of the lines before worrying about the meaning, so that the meaning becomes all the more meaningful as it resonates in our sensual experience. At the end of those two, it turned out to be 2.5 years, I had felt initiated. I felt initiated into not only into Tamil literature and poetry, but into poetry, period. I came back to English able to hear it in a way I had never heard it before, except perhaps as a child. And poetry opened up to me, and I began what has been a 20-year apprenticeship to language and to the inner lives of English, of Tamil, even of Spanish, as I had a chance later on to learn Spanish, and also some ancient Greek. And as I continued this odyssey, I went back to Tamil Nadu on a Fulbright grant in 2003 and 2004 to continue the study of the relationship between land and language. And as part of this study, I was staying with my Tamil teacher during the weeks, and on the weekends I'd go back to the village that I did end up living in for the last 1.5 years of my first stay, and where I had been adopted into the community as a son, as a brother. We read the great classical Tamil masterpiece on ethics, power, and love, the Kural. And we read it in a very specific way. We read we read all of the ancient commentaries, the commentaries from the 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, along with the original text, which scholars date somewhere between the 3rd and 5th centuries, although sometimes it's dated much earlier than that, and the question remains very much open. I memorized some 600 or 700 of its verses, and I even learned how to write in the language of this, how to write in the poetic form of this particular poet, Tiruvalluvar. I immersed myself in entering the work, and I immersed myself in it as a kind of apprentice, an apprentice to this master poet. I wanted to learn something through him, through his work, about words, about the power of words, the power of speech to transform the very fibers of our hearts. after this year of study, uh, I would talk from time to time with my Tamil teacher on the phone, or when I went back to visit him in South India, and he would say to me, "You know, Tom, somebody really ought to do a proper literary translation of this work. And this someone should look at all of the old commentaries that you and I studied together that year that you were living in my house." And I'd always say, yeah, that is a wonderful idea. I'm sure there's some up and coming PhD candidate somewhere who will take on such a project. I think that would be a beautiful thing." And it was really only a dozen years later, in 2015, that from somewhere, from some inner reaches of my own heart, the thought arose, maybe I'll try translating this book. I was then some 15 years into my apprenticeship, and I thought, maybe I have enough solidity as a poet in English and enough grounding as a poet and as a person in Tamil that perhaps I might be able to do some kind of justice to this masterpiece. And so on the 1st of January 2016, I began translating one verse a day. The book is organized into 133 chapters, each of which has 10 verses on one particular topic. And these are very short, 2-line, they're actually less than 2 lines long, very short verses on some topic. For instance, there's a verse on knowing the right time to do something, a chapter with 10 verses on knowing the right time to do something. There's a chapter on generosity, a chapter on hospitality, a chapter on knowing how to read people's faces, and so on. So when I had about 2 or 3 chapters in the first very rudimentary draft, I called up my Tamil teacher and I said, "Hey, that thought you'd had about somebody translating this? Well, I thought maybe I'll give it a try." And he said, "Oh, good. You finally got the hint. Now you get yourself back to Tamil Nadu and we'll look at your translation together and make it as good as we possibly can." And in the years since, I've thought that it's so interesting to me how my teacher suggested the project to me so gently that I didn't get the hint for so many years. Because in every other area of my relationship with him, he had no problem telling me exactly what he thought I should or shouldn't do, whether I wanted to hear it or not. But because my teacher was also a poet, I think he understood that you can't tell somebody to do a project like this. Either it will occur to them naturally or not. And I am exceedingly grateful that it did occur to me and that I was able to go back in 2017 for a summer and go through the entire manuscript with my teacher and have him push me as he had never pushed me before, both in my understanding of the original language, but also in the English, because he was very well read in English. And he could say things like, this verse isn't so bad, but it has no pizzazz. It's too long. It needs more life. It needs more energy. See what you can do. And I would see what I could do. And so it's really with great pleasure that I get to see now the book out in the world. It was published this past January by Beacon Press with, as Jim mentioned, an introduction from Andrew Harvey. There's also an introduction from the wonderful scholar Archana Venkatesan. And I've discovered something sort of curious during this process, because as I was translating this work and I was looking for support for it, I applied for and was very lucky to receive a National Endowment for the Arts translation fellowship. And I was startled to realize that there was no complete translation of this work into English in North America in print. Penguin Classics had a translation that they brought out in 1989, but I think that had gone out of print. And so here was this book that was revered by an entire civilization, by a language with more than 80 million speakers, a work of wisdom that is deeply rooted in a place in the earth, in a sensibility which is very earthy, gutsy, very interested in the nitty gritty of everyday life. How do we embody wisdom in everyday life that many of my English speaking friends had never heard of. And so now I discover myself in this very interesting and humbling and sometimes even harrowing position of being able to introduce this work. And so I'm very grateful to be able to be here with you and to share with you a taste of this work, because I think it speaks in some profound and astonishing ways directly to our predicament now, directly to the question of how do we live? How do we foster communities and countries that are able to be in harmony with each other, to be in peaceable relations with each other, and to flourish together on this living earth? How do we connect the inner world, the seemingly inner world of our hearts, with the seemingly outer world all around us? How do we discover the continuity, the deep embodied relationship between the inner and the outer? So I thought I would share a couple verses from the book. I'll share them both in the English. I'll also share the original Tamil so you can hear at least a little bit of the music of the original language. And then I'll be looking forward to a conversation with Jim. So the work, as I mentioned, has 133 chapters, each of which deals with some specific aspect of life. And these chapters are divided into 3 books or 3 parts of the larger whole. And these are the parts on ethics, power, and love. So let me share a verse or two from the first section on ethics. And in North America, in the West more generally, there is a common idea, and there's historical reasons for this, that ethics is a kind of impersonal or universal set of rules and guidance. And there's some truth, of course, to that vision. But what I find so nourishing about the wisdom tradition that this book comes out of and embodies is its exquisite understanding of context, of ethics as interrelatedness, ethics as how any of us in our particular circumstances, with the particular inclination of our own hearts, meets the wider and more than human world within us and around us. So, for example, after the first chapter of the work, which speaks of what could be translated either as God or the gods or the godlike qualities of great teachers, the very second chapter is on the glory of rain, so that in our spiritual journeys, we are also on bodily journeys, earthly ecological journeys of really honoring what it means for the rain to fall and nourish the earth and nourish the crops, nourish the possibility of living. And for example, here's the 10th verse of the 10 verses from the chapter on the glory of rain. No being can be without water. Nothing can flow for anyone without rain. Niren ramaya dulaginin, yar kumbanin ramaya dulage. Niren ramaya dulaginin, yar kumbanin ramaya dorake. No being can be without water. Nothing can flow for anyone without rain. And in this verse, as I bring out, as I've tried to bring out not only in the translation itself, but also in the commentary that is part of this book, there is a beautiful word for conduct. And this word for conduct, for good conduct in the world, connects to the way that water flows through the earth, as a river flows through the earth. River and earth shaping each other. And so in the verse when it says nothing can flow for anyone without rain, we're speaking of the way that good conduct flows from our hearts when water and earth are flowing together. flowing unimpeded through the landscape. And I have a personal connection to this verse because long before I knew what was happening, I was being prepared to understand this word, the word I've translated here as flow, and where I've translated as conduct in other parts of this translation. Because the first time I learned the word, oraku or orakam, conduct, my Tamil teacher took me outside to the back of his house, and he pointed up. And he pointed up at the system. The house had a flat roof, and when the rain fell, the water would fall on the roof and would come out the catchment and come down, and then it would go to. They had a little garden in the back of the house, a beautiful mango tree, some guava trees, a sapota tree, various kinds of vegetables, and so all of the rainwater would go into their little backyard garden. And he pointed to how the water from the recent days' rain was coming down the side of the building. And he said, that is orake. That is the way that water flows, the nature of water flowing down, moving according to its nature. And I remember thinking, and at that point I was thinking of the word very much in its physical and earthly sense. But that image has stayed with me as a reminder of how an everyday experience can become a reminder of the possibility of free-flowing conduct that nourishes ourselves and nourishes others, human and more than human others that we are in relationship with. So that is a taste of the first part of the 3 parts of this book on ethics. And as I was thinking about before coming into this gathering, I had selected some verses to share from the second section, and I'm actually not going to share those. I want to share one that occurred to me listening to Jim introduce the topic for today, because of the nature of the time that we continue to be in, with all of its chaos and confusion and possibility and hope. The second part of this book deals with what we could translate as power or prosperity, wealth. It deals with what it means to be a leader. What is the nature of a leader? What is the learning required of a leader? And we can read this as in the archetypal sense of a king, or in a very practical sense of a leader in any part of our life experience. It also deals with how does a leader surround himself, herself, themselves with trusted advisors. And among the chapters in the second part of the book, which is the longest part of the book, there's a chapter on not being defeated by adversity. And one of my favorite verses from that chapter goes like this: when the wise look within, the flood of adversity vanishes. வளத்தனிய எடும்பாய் அறிவுடையான் உள்ளத்தின் உள்ள கெடும். When the wise look within, the flood of adversity vanishes. I think when I read this verse, when I say this verse out loud, I think of Gandhi, because interestingly, the Kural was a book that inspired Gandhi so much that he, at one point in his life, wanted to learn the Tamil language just so he could read it. He once said in a speech that no other work has given so much to the people in so few words as this one and this poet. And I think of Gandhi's own capacity to be in the midst of enormous strife, in the midst, for instance, of the riots between Muslims and Hindus following partition, and all of all of that time of strife leading up to what became partition. How even in such a time he understood the meeting between the spiritual life and the political life, the life of the community, and that there is a possibility that is always with us of being able to find that calm within. which allows us to be in adversity without being taken up by the adversity, which is the only way we can act in adversity with any kind of wisdom. The only way we can embody a response that can be a response and not a reaction. I had a conversation with a wonderful spiritual guide and teacher named Fiona Moore about this verse. And one of the things I've been doing in my effort to share this work with others is I've been in conversation as I will be with Jim, which I'm very excited about, with teachers, with spiritual teachers from all different kinds of traditions, with painters, with healers, people who have in fact no connection themselves necessarily to the Tamil language, and we find ourselves talking about these verses. These verses become an occasion for conversation, for a deepening of our friendship, a deepening of our mutual understanding, our mutual insight. And she pointed out something beautiful about this verse. She said, notice how the verse invites us ever so gently into wisdom. When the wise look within, the flood of adversity vanishes. It is a verse that is inviting us to be among the wise, to be among the wise and to experience what it means to watch the flood-like experience of adversity transform, so that we can meet whatever we meet before us with integrity and with compassion and with love. One of the many reasons why I love this work is precisely for the way that it can illuminate the present, what we face right now and right here. The third part of this work deals with love. And it deals with love, it deals specifically with romantic love, with erotic love, but in the sense of how we fall in love with each other, how we fall in love in such a way that that love might even be secret to ourselves, to the person, to our beloved, our would-be beloved, and then also to the work of committed relationship, to married life with all of its paradoxical ins and outs. And so the work ends, let me see. There's so many beautiful verses that I could share from this chapter. Here are some. The last 3 chapters in this work deal with sulking. They deal with the way when we are in a long-term committed relationship, things come up, little misunderstandings happen. There are confusions, there are arguments. And in some ways, it seems strange that this magisterial work on ethics, power, and love ends with 3 chapters on sulking. And the last chapter, the second to last chapter is called Sulking's Subtleties. The last chapter is called Sulking and Bliss, because somehow the poet wants to tell us, to show us, to have us experience how even these seemingly private squabbles we may have in our homes are also connected to liberation, are also connected to the bliss of embodied freedom here and hereafter. So how does the poet talk about this? Well, here are 2 verses about the experience of sulking, just to give a little taste of this part of the book, which is one of the most playful and delightful and rollicking parts of the book. Here are 2 verses that come from the second to last chapter on sulking's subtleties. And it's in the voice, in this case, of a young man who, with his wife, and he says, I held back a sneeze, and she wept, saying, whose thought do you hide? There is an idea in Tamil and also in other cultures and languages that if somebody sneezes, it's because somebody else is thinking about them. So he says, I held back a sneeze, and she wept, saying, whose thought do you hide? She has this suspicion that he's somebody else, he's involved with somebody else. He's not. But this is how these doubts can creep in and cause these emotional turmoil and confusion. And the next verse after that says, the verse right next to it, and before it says, I sneezed and she blessed me, then wept, saying, "Who made you sneeze?" And the commentator, one of the old commentators, the oldest commentator, says, "If he sneezes, he's in trouble. If he holds back his sneeze, he's in trouble." And this is the kind of dilemma that we can find ourselves in, the actual experience of being in a relationship. And now you may ask, well, what does it have to do with liberation, with ethics, with the fate of the world? Well, two things. One is that in this process, when we're in relationship with each other and we are able to be aware of, and even laugh at the ways our hearts interact with each other's hearts, we involve ourselves in a process which is alchemical, in which every time we turn away in confusion or doubt and dare to come back again, the turning back is all the more glorious, all the more fruitful. We've grown. We've grown in our understanding of each other. We've grown in understanding of ourselves. The very last verse of this entire work puts it this way: sulking in love is joy, and joining again, joy of joys. Because this process of turning away is a part of turning back again. And we can see this in our larger experience, that the process of things seeming to go quite awry is also part of the process of them coming back again, perhaps in a new form, perhaps in a new way that they need to come back together, so that they can be back together more fully, more wholly, and more beautifully. And the other part is that this process of coming back again is akin to the way that water and earth move together. That there is a way that those elements, as actual physical elements and as emblems or symbols for elements of our own experience, of our own hearts, there is a naturalness, there is a kind of freedom and free-flowing abundance that can come with that. So one more verse, and then we'll enter into some conversation. One more verse about this experience of sulking. Hearts joined like earth and water, what heaven transcends their sulking? Here we have the paradox of the possibility of joining like earth and water, and of the heaven involved in being in that relationship, which takes us from looking away to looking back again more fully. So I thank you for the way that I have felt all of you listening, and I look forward to some conversation.
Thank you, Thomas, so much. The way you speak Tamil makes your heart just open. It's so rounded and full of feeling when you speak Tamil. It's very enticing. It's almost seductive the way you recite Tamil.
Well, thank you. You know, I that makes me want to add that, you know, my ability to speak the language came on the one hand from my Tamil teacher, but also came from this beautiful village outside of the city of Madurai, where people, many of whom don't even read, and yet they embody some of the many of the virtues that are praised in this work in extraordinary ways. And they, as much as my teacher taught me to speak. And so when you hear me speak Tamil, you're hearing them as much as him.
Yes, yes. Well, one of our listeners, Catherine Alexander, was suggesting that you do an audiobook.
I think that's a wonderful idea. I have thought of that. And in fact, in the interim, my husband and I have recorded a series of videos where I share a verse in English and then in the Tamil and then in English again, that are being released they're on my website and on YouTube and so on. I can drop a link in the chat toward the end.
That would be
people
wonderful.
Are interested.
That would be wonderful.
Just because of that experience of hearing the language. So
I'd like to probe your experience with language just as we begin our dialogue. Now, you have no Indian ancestry, right?
No.
Yeah. You were kind of American through and through.
Well,
And
yes and no. I mean, I have American through and through with this interesting undercurrent of my experience of my Okinawan family and my Okinawan American family on my mother's side.
oh, on
Uh,
your mother's side. Because the
mhm.
reason why I'm interested is here you are, kind of a stranger in a strange land,
Yes.
and you begin to learn the language. And what I'm really interested in is how learning the Tamil language changed the architecture in your mind. Because one of the things that we know about language is that language and thinking and language and feeling are all intertwined, so that the culture you grow up in and the language that you speak shapes fundamental aspects of your epistemology, and in fact your identity. So here you were as a young man going to the other side of the world, sort of literally, having been sort of a English speaker, maybe with a smattering of Japanese, and then you immersed yourself in that language. How did it change the way you thought? How did it change the way you felt? What uh, aspects of existence got opened up for you through learning this language?
That's a really wonderful question. And in fact, I had gone to South India with an interest in um, what it might help me see, how it might change the very texture not only of my experience, but of how I think about how I experience my experience. I had actually just the year before I went to India, I'd been reading Wittgenstein and his comments on the way language can be like a cage, and we don't really know that until we sort of step out of the cage
Exactly.
and you step into another language.
Yeah.
Um, and so, uh, there's so many things I could say. Let me just listen for what might be most useful. There, my teacher took me into the Tamil language by once I had enough fluency to be able to do this sort of thing. He sat me down and we went through the entire dictionary, and this is over a period of a year. And he went through and he said, I'm going to give you the 2,000 most important words for you to know, so you have a kind of base vocabulary. And what I discovered in this process, which at times was quite laborious and seemed unending, was that every aspect of my experience, of our experience, uh, there are sometimes words for them. And these words are different in different languages. They have different connotations. They connect to different
Right.
things. So here's an example. In English, we might say something like, "Oh, that really warms my heart." Heartwarming, to speak about a kind of a flow of energy in our heart, a sense of well-being and compassion. Well, in Tamil, if something happens that makes you very happy, you might say, "Oh, it cools my heart," or it's like coolness being flowing down upon my head. And this seems, when you think cold-hearted in English, that idiom suggests closedness, a kind of sternness, a kind of emotional unavailability, as we might say. And yet, think now about language and place, land and language.
Mm.
In the South Indian state of Tamil Nadu, where it is very warm and sometimes very hot, there is such pleasure in coolness, cool water flowing upon your head. And so, of course, we can think of coolness as a delight, as a joy. Whereas, of course, in a place, a northern language like English, which comes from a much cooler climate, of course, we would want language to be warming. We would want experience to be warming. And so the entire set of metaphors for our experience start to shift. Here's another example. In Tamil, you can think about having an emotion come to you. In English, we say, "I am happy," "I am sad," as if that is somehow defining of our identity, that I
Mhm.
become that thing. And there is a use to that that can be helpful for us to think about and experience that. And it is also possible in other languages to have those emotions come to us. Anger comes to me. Anger arises in me. And that offers another complementary healing possibility that, oh yeah, I am not my anger. I am the one experiencing my anger, my sorrow, my delight, my joy, so that I can be in relationship with that.
Mm.
And so, there are all sorts of ways in which there are these different idioms and different metaphors. But I think even at a deeper level for me, it was the entry into poetry, into the poetic sensibility of Tamar, which really awakened me to to many of the poetic sensibilities in English, which transformed my relationship to language being as a sort of a means of communicating information, to language as a presence, to language as a companion, to language as the voices of the dead in communion and community, speaking through time into the present and reminding us of the relations between things, between the elements of our experience, and between different cultures and different worlds. And so those are some of the elements which occur to me to share in response to your question.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think it was probably amplified by the fact that, as you indicated in your opening remarks, Tamil is one of those classical languages that have endured over time.
Yes.
To the present day. So you had the luxury really of looking at how the connotation of words have changed over thousands of years now.
Yes, and it was
And and everyone, just to get a measure of it in English, try reading the King James version of the Bible.
yes.
That was written in the 17th century, and then go back to Chaucer. But English, didn't exist 2,000 years ago. It's a relatively recent language, and so Thomas was drinking of a very deep well.
That's beautifully put. I mean, there's a way in which the language has been refined by generations of speakers, by generations of poets, decanted, distilled, enlivened, enriched by the experience of so many different people, including beautiful women who were poets. Even 2,000 years ago, there were poets, women poets, singing their poems, sharing their poems, and given the equal respect with men. And so there are riches in this tradition, and including the Kural, which, even though it's 15 or more centuries old, a speaker in Tamar can enter into the work. You have 7-year-old, 8-year-old kids who memorize the work, the entire work, as part of competitions for school, and you can enter into it and be nourished by it, which is really one of the things that makes it such a beautiful and astonishing language.
Yeah. It is a fascinating thing. People memorize the entire Quran, for example, or Torah, the Bhagavad Gita. These books are so precious in a culture that people open their hearts to the totality of the compendium of scripture and just absorb it.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And that leads to my next question of how would you have described your, say, spirituality or religion before going to South India, and how has the immersion there and now the translation of the Kural transformed your spiritual awareness?
That's another very beautiful question. So I was raised in a Protestant Christian church, and I also, with the experience of my grandparents on my mother's side who had become Christians, but who continued to honor their ancestors as their ancestors had honored our ancestors. But by the time I was going to South India, I'd become kind of an agnostic, almost a closet atheist. I studied philosophy, but these questions were very much alive in my mind. And they had gone from being sort of questions that I thought of as being spiritual or religious to being questions I thought of more simply as ethical or questions of morals, questions of virtue and ethics. And so by the time I was going to live in this village in Tamil Nadu, I was very much interested in the relationship, social relationships, relationship between people and the earth, sort of an ecological ethic. And through that process, and through encountering the gods, for instance, of this village, and this village had Hindus of different communities. It had Muslims. It had Christians. Through encountering the gods and the different traditions of this village in a place in the world where religious life is very much part of the wider life, and profound spiritual traditions intertwine, I found all of those questions reconfigured, shook up,
Mm.
rearranged, mixed up inside of me. Um, and particularly with poetry, because of course so many beautiful poetic traditions around the world grow out of beautiful spiritual and religious and mystical traditions. And so, there was a time in which if somebody were to ask me if I had a religion, I'd probably say my religion is something like poetry and something like words. More specifically, that journey in South India not only opened me to the different Hindu traditions. I've I've translated both Vaishnavite and Shaivite poets, for instance, but also to the earth spirituality traditions that I met in this particular village, that I've met in southern Mexico, as well as so I've become a kind of a translator, not just of languages and poetry, but I'm also learning now how to translate between religious traditions, between, for instance, the Christianity I grew up in, the Sufism that I've been experiencing for the last 10 years through a particular community, the Buddhist, another mindfulness, particularly through the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh and through a Buddhist community in Seattle. Because I find that the work of the poet is to articulate those experiences, those deepest experiences of our hearts, which of course include the cosmos, which of course include our sense of the divine or of love or of Buddha nature or whatever name we give to it. And so my own journey has been one of listening as deeply as I can to my own experience, to the experience of others, and to the ways that it occurs to me to articulate those experiences in a way that reach across the divisions that we tend to place between ourselves, within ourselves, and in the world.
Mhm. Well, let's probe that a little deeper around these questions of ethics, power, and love, just to get a sense of the Kural and that cultural milieu. Let's take ethics, for example. In contrast with Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which really shaped Western civilization. This whole notion that happiness is the pursuit of excellence, and that the highest good in life, in Aristotle's notion, was not being enlightened. It was being happy. It was feeling fulfilled as a human being in society. And that the way to cultivate ethics was to cultivate the virtues in oneself. And that comes down in Aristotle's mind around the choices we make moment by moment through the day of whether we're going to do the virtuous thing or not. And the more we can do the virtuous thing, the more virtue becomes a habit. And he makes this point that at the beginning of the journey of virtue toward excellence and happiness, like an athlete learning how to play soccer, it's hard and you need a lot of training. But the more you practice, the more natural it becomes, so that the highest level is reserved for those who practice the hardest and the longest. Now, as you understand ethics from South India and the Kural, how would you kind of compare to the Aristotelian notion of ethics? What was the essence of ethics in that masterpiece?
Beautiful question. And I love that you you invite Aristotle into our conversation, because I have a particular
I love
fondness
Aristotle.
for the Aristotelian interest in virtue, in character, and the
Yeah.
kind of people we want to become, which of course sort of gets sort of pushed to the side when we get to the Enlightenment and the so-called Enlightenment and Hume and Kant, et cetera, et cetera. What what occurs to me to say is that um, one of the beautiful things about the Kural and about my experience of various sort of notions of right action in South India has to do with the fundamental importance of context, of fit. I
Mm.
mentioned the sense of fit between water and land. At the end of the fourth chapter, and the first four chapters of the Kural are a kind of introduction to the whole work. The fourth chapter is on the imperative of right action, or of good action, of virtue, we could say. The last of those 10 verses says, action that fits is virtue. Action that doesn't is vice. And so in very simple but powerful language, we're reminded that ethics can be, and virtue can be seen as fit. How do we correspond with
Mm.
each other?
Mhm.
And what fits our own unique nature, for wherever we find ourselves in our life, with whatever talents and experiences and trauma and deficiencies or perceived deficiencies we may happen to have. How do we fit our own nature? How does that nature fit other natures? Uh, and so this question of fit becomes important. In fact, the entire work can be read, one could see it, 1,330 verses that all apply to life. And of course, they all do apply to life. But any particular person encountering this work might find those 29 verses that speak directly to them, that somehow become their own unique, the Kural that fits them, if you will, their station
Mm.
in life, their experience of life. And there's this honoring of the uniqueness of paths. And in fact, there are many verses which speak directly about how there are different paths, different moral systems, religious systems, ethical systems, that are right for different people. In fact, here's one example. In the third verse, the third chapter, which is on the greatness of letting go, the first verse of that chapter says, good books agree. The great let go in that way which is theirs. And so there's an agreement on letting people discover that way which is theirs, as and of course the word here for way can also mean river. So that, just as water in this watershed will seek this way to the ocean, water in this other watershed will seek its own way to the ocean, and they both lead to the ocean. This is the kind of imagery that we get. And there's one more
It's a much
verse.
more Taoist notion
Yes, I've
where
often thought of
context
that.
affects content, and it's understanding the flow of what you're in, and that's what
Yes.
determines the right action.
Yes.
So it's much more situational.
Exactly. It's
Yeah,
deeply
yeah,
situational,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and deeply relational. And in
yeah,
fact, one of the
yeah.
ways that these verses, when people take verses and memorize them, for instance, in the flux and flow of life, a verse will occur to you that will apply to a situation, and then maybe another verse will occur to you, and those verses will be in commentary on each other, and in dialogue with you. So you were talking about the Aristotelian sense of, you work hard to become virtuous, right? You work to cultivate the habits of goodness, to become excellent at goodness, at virtue. And of course, there are lots of beautiful verses in the Kural about excellence and greatness as well. And there's a beautiful verse that I love, from a chapter on having kindness. And this word kindness, that I've translated as kindness, both in Tamil and in English, has a deeper root. In English, we think about kindness as being, nice, being generous with people. But there's the word kind is a powerful word, because it has to do with the nature of something, the kind of thing that it is in the world. And
Mm,
so kindness is about how do we be true
mm,
to the kind of being that we are as a human being, as a particular human being in a particular life story. And how do we honor that in ourselves? How do we honor that in others? And so here's a verse on that. From openness to all people, the practice of kindness comes easily.
mm.
And I love
Openness to
how
all people. Kindness
here,
comes easily.
as we embody the quality of openness, and I think now here we are in the month of Ramadan, and I think of the Quran beginning with the chapter of the surah on the opener, the divine quality of openness. That
Mm.
with openness, the practice of kindness comes easily, and I love this this counterpart to the idea that you have to work hard to be good. That it's that, and of course, that, which is not to say that that's
Yeah, yeah,
not
yeah.
true. That is
Yeah,
also true. That too is a way to the sea.
yeah, yeah,
That's what I
yeah.
want to say.
Good one, good one, good one. And let's try power. And I'm thinking here of the Jewish notion of power as Titanism, that the great seduction of power is hubris,
Hmm.
that we think we're equal to God.
Yeah,
And that's, of course, embedded in the story of the Garden of Eden, that Adam and Eve felt themselves to be able to challenge the strictures of God. And therefore, they transcended the laws of the wisdom of limits and ended up in a catastrophe. So that this danger that's very deeply embedded in the Judeo-Christian, even the Islamic tradition, and therefore shaping Western civilization around power is something that you need to be extremely careful with, because it's like the ring. Think of the
hmm,
Lord of the Rings, the ring of power, and this notion of Lord Atlees, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
absolutely.
How would you express the way the Kural expresses the notion of power and how we should relate to power?
That's a fabulous question. Um, Again, there's lots of different things I could say, but let me see. Um, One of the things that strikes me about the image that we get of the sovereign, of the leader in the Kural, is that the leader never stands alone.
Mm.
As important are the circle of advisors, and in historically, culturally, in Tamil Nadu, the land of Tamar, these would be poet scholars. Can you imagine if our world leaders today were surrounded by circles of advisors who were poets? Fantasize for a moment.
Yeah,
Um,
let's
uh,
fantasize. Poets surrounding Trump.
exactly, exactly. Um, and these poets, let me see if I can find the verse. Uh, and these, so among the virtues that fit a leader, a sovereign, are the virtues of listening, the capacity to listen, the capacity to seek help from those who are greater than you. So already there's a kind of inbuilt understanding of the danger of hubris. And so here's one verse that occurs to me. Um, and here it takes the image of the sovereign as a king. Who can ruin the king who rules counsel prepared to thunder? And here thunder is referring to the capacity of the advisors of a leader to rail against the leader, to say, hey, look, buddy, you got it wrong. That ain't the way at all. And that it is of the nature of a leader to assemble and listen to a circle of advisors who will tell you when you're wrong, who will rail against you, who will thunder, knowing that their thunder will be heard. And I can see how important this is in our own lives now. Anytime we want to affect meaningful change in the world, there's always the specter of power. There's the specter, what happens when we get it and suddenly things are happening as we might want them to happen, where the danger lies, where suddenly we could become, there's that possibility of corruption. And so one of the ways that the Kural advises us is by saying that if we remain related in humble service and humble listening to others, that danger is deeply mitigated. And instead we get to draw upon our shared wisdom, our shared understanding, the wisdom of people who may not find themselves wanting to be or inclined to being a leader, a sovereign of some kind, but they have that capacity of vision of the poet scholar. They have that capacity to thunder when thunder is what we need.
It reminds me too of the Native American notion around power. And I was just finishing David Gribbenau's work, The Dawn of Everything. And he tells the history of when the Europeans first came to North America, the dialogues that they had with the Native Americans there around power. The Native Americans were astonished that there was no place in the European way of exercising power that allowed for dissent. And some of the great dialogues that they had was that the king can be the king, but we as the people always have the right to disobey.
Yes.
And we always have the right to move away.
Yes.
And that was the way that they calibrated the social relationship with power. So it's a beautiful thing. You surround the leader with poets, and you allow them to be thunderous, even with the person who is identified as the monarch. That's a beautiful notion, because again, it's contextual.
Yes.
It's contextual,
rather
than ontological. I think the West succumbed to this Aristotelian ontology. I am monarch, you obey. And the ethics is something you work on really, really hard to get to the top of that mountain. And there's just another way to look at it, everyone. It's just another way to look at it.
And the
Which
question
brings us to love.
I was just going to add one last thing, which is that as the contextual nature of power, of ethics arises, that's also the ecological nature, right? Yeah. Because our context is always an ecological context.
Yes.
How does the way that the sovereign and the poet advisors of the sovereign, what do they understand about the world? The actual physical living world, the breathing world that supports every thought that we ever have, the body which allows for every thought and feeling we may ever have. That too is part of that contextual wisdom.
Yeah, and because that was missing in the West, it's not until the 21st century we're even waking up to the fact that context matters.
Yes. Yeah.
And so the distinctions that you're drawing are so important. Thank you so much. So love. Let's just take Diotima's teaching to Socrates that's encoded in Plato's Symposium about love. The way that he defined love, or Diotima defined love, is that she explained it to Socrates as the intermediary intelligence that binds all things together and transforms and shapes them into something beautiful. So that in the Platonic notion, even love, which is considered to be the absolute in many traditions, serves beauty. So from the Kural's point of view and your study of the theology and spirituality in that part of the world, how would you define or articulate the essence of love?
Hmm. Two things that occur to me to say. One is that, so these three books, we have virtue, or these three parts. We have virtue, we have ethics, virtue, power, and love. In many forms of Hindu tradition, there are four main parts of life. Those are the first three, and then there's a fourth, which is liberation, freedom. Liberation from the cycle of birth and death would be one way to describe it. And it's interesting, and commentators for centuries have pointed out that here we have three of the four. Why is this, they ask? And the answer for generations has been, because if you do these first three right, the fourth happens naturally, of a course. And so, for instance, I think it's absolutely fascinating that the chapters I was sharing a couple of verses from earlier about this process of turning away and turning back are right before the unwritten fourth book on liberation. And that there's a way in which our fumbly experience of relatedness, the ins and outs of relatedness, are part of that possibility of freedom, are part of that possibility of stepping beyond the cycle of suffering that we often bring upon ourselves, and that love, the life of the heart with the beloved, is part of that. And also how that question of love in this third part of the book returns us to the question of love in the first part of the book, which has to do with the love of our homes, the love in our families, the love that, and also the second part, the love that the sovereign, that a leader of any kind shows towards the people that they are serving. And so there's one verse in particular that occurs to me to share that may say it better than I than I can, which has to do. There's a beautiful sense in both the second and first parts of the Kural about compassion being. There's one of the words for compassion is eyes that are moved. The capacity to be moved by the circumstance of another, the capacity to be moved by our own life circumstances. So here is one verse from the chapter on having love, which comes in the first section on ethics and virtue. And it has to do with how it gives us an image for how do we know love? How do we experience love in our day-to-day lives? The poet asks, is there a latch for love? The fullness of one's heart shows in the tears that well. Anbirkumundo arekumtar arbalar punkanir pusal tarum. Is there a latch for love? The fullness of one's heart shows in the tears that well. And so here, one of the many ways we can understand love in this tradition is the capacity to be in felt relationship with each other and with the world, to be moved by our relations with each other, to cultivate that fullness of heart.
Beautifully put, and again, the contrast, everyone, there's something abstract about the Platonic notion of love. It's almost disembodied.
Yes.
And even the Christian agape is, love one another as a command. But what you're bringing out, Thomas, is in many ways the intimacy of love. And what was striking to me when I was reading the chapter on love is how intimate it was. And as you pointed out, it ends with the sulkiness of love. I mean, this masterwork ends its discourse on love with the sulkiness of love, and how none of us among us have not sulked
Yes.
with their beloved. So this notion of the intimate, the personal, the shadow content where love lurks and shapes is again a beautiful contrast with the abstractions that we feel as commands in the West.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is good. Well, this has been so rich, Thomas. Thank you so much. So let's end with you. You know, we're in a crazy world. We're in a world of escalating turbulence. We're in a world where the center does not hold. What comes to your mind in this moment that you would share with our global audience from the Kural that just would help center us in a world spinning out of control? Just as a final thought.
I would share something of what what has moved me most about this tradition, which is its deep conviction, its deep understanding of how our inner lives, our inner turmoil count as much as the outer turmoil. I remember as a student, particularly as a college student, feeling torn up by this sense that I had my own personal artistic aspirations, and then I looked out at this world which seemed to be totally falling apart, in total disarray, and thinking, well, I guess I just chuck all of the things that move my heart and I kind of put my nose to the grindstone and I fix the problem, right? I go and I save the world. That's the simplest way to put it. Which is a noble impulse. I would never discount that impulse. And yet there is a kind of unkindness involved, which is an unkindness to our hearts, to our own nature, to the reality of our felt experience. And what I have learned most deeply from Tamar, from my friends in Tamil Nadu, from this work in particular, is how these things are not opposed. That caring for our hearts, cultivating compassion in our hearts is the great work of caring for the world, of confronting with dignity, integrity, and compassion, horrific situations that we're called to respond to. And so here's one last verse I'd like to share, which is from a chapter addressed to leaders, to the sovereign, on compassion, eyes that are moved. And it's the first verse of those 10 verses, and it's sort of the key to that whole chapter and to the whole idea of compassion. The astonishing beauty of eyes that are moved, because it exists. This world exists. The astonishing beauty of eyes that are moved, because it exists. This world exists.
Beautiful, Thomas. You're a beautiful man. Your voice has been beautiful. It's soothed my soul today. It's been an honor being in dialogue with you about these very weighty matters that have to do with our capacity, quite literally, to live in the fullness of life.
Yes.
Rather than in its scarcity.
Yes.
And so you've
beautifully
performed a great service for humanity, actually, in translating this masterwork from South India, so little known, but now available to the English-speaking world, so that anybody anywhere can read it and be illumined. So I really want to express my deep thanks for you and everything that you've done. And I hope to have you back down the trail.
Well, thank you, Jim. It's really been an honor to be in conversation with you. I've dropped into the chat a link we can learn more about the book, a link which includes those videos of me sharing some of those verses out loud, as well as some of these conversations I've been having with people. But it's been a particular privilege and honor to share it in this this global commons that you are such a gracious participant in and host for and guide within, because there is such a conversation to be had, conversation of conversations, which can return us to ourselves.
Yeah.
Return us to our deepest felt sense of possibility, the possibility that we can, the possibility and possibilities that we bring into being together every time we are truly together.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Kural, everyone, by Hitoshi Pruiksma. It's well worth getting and reading. That brings our session to a close. We want to welcome all of you to join our after session chat group. You'll see the link in the chat box. Thomas, I hope you can join us for at least a few moments. And then tomorrow, everyone, we're going to go to another corner of the universe, to a man who's been in prison in the United States, Leonard Peltier, for about 40 years. Very active in the American Indian movement in the 1970s, was found guilty of being involved in the murder of 2 FBI agents. Like with so many incidences of this nature, there were much controversy. There was a global effort, including the Dalai Lama and Pope Francis, to enable him to leave prison. And so we're going to hear from people who've been involved with his story and in the global campaign to release Leonard Peltier. So that'll be tomorrow on Humanity Rising. Thanks again, Thomas. Wonderful session. Bye, everyone. That'll do it for us for today. See you tomorrow. Bye for now.